Britain's imperial story does not begin with ships or colonies. It begins with an island that had already been conquered repeatedly before it ever conquered anyone else. Roman legions occupied Britain for nearly 4 centuries starting in 43 CE, building roads, forts, and the city of Londinium, before withdrawing in the early 5th century and leaving a power vacuum that Anglo-Saxon settlers from continental Europe filled over the following centuries. Viking raiders followed, seizing large parts of eastern and northern England and forcing Anglo-Saxon kings into decades of war and negotiated partition. Then, in 1066, a Norman duke named William crossed the English Channel, defeated the Anglo-Saxon King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, and imposed French-speaking Norman rule over the entire English aristocracy, a conquest so total that English itself was reshaped, absorbing thousands of French words into what had been a Germanic language, producing the hybrid vocabulary English speakers still use today. For roughly 1,000 years before Britain colonized anyone, Britain itself had been colonized, again and again, by outsiders. That inherited experience of invasion, conquest, and forced administrative reorganization would later become, almost point for point, the operating manual Britain used on the rest of the world. England spent the medieval and early modern centuries not building an empire, but surviving inside one continuous, exhausting cycle of internal war and near collapse. The 100 Years' War against France, fought intermittently from 1337 to 1453, drained English treasuries and armies for generations without producing lasting territorial gain. The Wars of the Roses, a brutal decades-long civil war between rival branches of the English royal family, nearly destroyed the English nobility outright before ending in 1485 with the rise of the Tudor dynasty. England at this point was not a great power. It was a mid-sized, financially exhausted kingdom on the edge of Europe, staring across the Channel at Spain and Portugal, who were already growing wealthy on trade routes and colonies across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Portuguese and Spanish sailors had already reached India, the Americas, and the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia before England had a navy capable of safely crossing open ocean. England did not start the age of exploration. It started decades behind it, watching its rivals get rich. The Tudor monarchs, and Elizabeth I in particular, changed this by necessity as much as ambition. Facing the threat of Catholic Spain, then the wealthiest and most powerful empire on earth, Elizabeth's government quietly licensed English privateers, state-sanctioned pirates, to raid Spanish treasure ships returning from the Americas, loaded with silver mined by enslaved and forced indigenous labor in Peru and Mexico. Sir Francis Drake, one of the most famous of these privateers, circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580, raiding Spanish ports and ships along the way, and returned to England with plunder so vast that Elizabeth's single share of the profits reportedly exceeded the entire annual revenue of the English crown. This was not the polished language of empire that would come later. It was, at its founding moment, closer to state-sponsored theft, dressed up in royal charters and patriotic language about English liberty against Spanish tyranny. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, when a combination of English naval tactics and catastrophic storms destroyed the fleet Spain had sent to invade England, did something more important than simply saving the country from conquest. Before any of this reached the Americas or Asia, England had already been rehearsing colonization far closer to home, in Ireland, and the methods developed there would be reused, almost point for point, across the empire that followed. English monarchs had claimed lordship over Ireland since the 12th century, but the systematic colonization that historians consider the true template for later empire began under the Tudors in the 16th century, through a policy known as Plantation, confiscating land from Irish Catholic landowners, frequently following military conquest or rebellion, and redistributing it to English and Scottish Protestant settlers considered more loyal to the crown. The Plantation of Ulster, beginning in 1609, forcibly resettled large portions of Northern Ireland with Protestant settlers from Scotland and England, a demographic and religious reshaping whose consequences, including the sectarian divisions underlying the 20th century conflict known as the Troubles, are still directly traceable 4 centuries later. Oliver Cromwell's military campaign in Ireland during the 1650s, undertaken partly in retaliation for an Irish Catholic uprising and partly to permanently subdue the island, killed a substantial portion of the Irish population through combat and famine and disease, with some estimates suggesting Ireland's population fell by as much as a third during the campaign and its aftermath, while Cromwell's forces confiscated vast additional tracts of Catholic-owned land for redistribution to English settlers and soldiers. The most devastating single consequence of this colonial land system arrived 2 centuries later, during the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852, when a potato blight destroyed the primary subsistence crop that a colonial land system had forced much of the Irish rural poor to depend on almost exclusively, while landlords, many of them absentee and English, continued exporting other Irish-grown food crops out of the country for profit throughout the famine's worst years. Roughly 1 million people died of starvation and disease, and a further 1 to 2 million emigrated, permanently reducing Ireland's population by an estimated 20 to 25% within less than a decade. A demographic collapse from which parts of rural Ireland have, by some measures, never fully recovered even today. The British government's relief response was widely criticized at the time and by historians since as inadequate, ideologically constrained by prevailing laissez-faire economic theory, and in some documented instances, actively obstructive. Ireland's colonial relationship with Britain, closer geographically than any other colonized territory, and therefore easy to overlook in the wider imperial story, provided the administrative, legal, and demographic techniques, land confiscation, plantation settlement, and the deliberate favoring of one religious or ethnic group over another to secure local control, that British colonial administrators would apply, adapted to local circumstances, across the rest of the empire for the following 3 centuries. Within a generation, English merchants and investors, sensing opportunity, began forming joint stock companies specifically designed to fund long-distance trading and colonizing voyages by pooling investor capital and spreading financial risk, a genuinely novel business structure for its time. The most consequential of these was chartered by Elizabeth I in the final days of the year 1600. The English East India Company, granted a royal monopoly on English trade with Asia. Almost no one involved in founding it could have imagined that this private trading company, run by merchants in London, would eventually command its own army, larger than most European nations, and effectively govern the Indian subcontinent for over a century before the British government ever formally took control. England's earliest American colonies were, in blunt terms, failures wrapped in propaganda. The Roanoke colony, founded in 1585 on the coast of modern-day North Carolina, vanished entirely by 1590. Its fate still debated by historians, the word Croatoan, carved into a post, being the only clue left behind. Jamestown, founded in Virginia in 1607, nearly collapsed multiple times from starvation, disease, and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy, the indigenous alliance whose territory the English were settling on without meaningful consent. Roughly 80% of the original Jamestown settlers died within the colony's first few years. What ultimately saved English colonization in North America was not gold or glory, but a plant. John Rolfe's successful cultivation of a marketable strain of tobacco in Virginia, around 1612, turned a starving, failing outpost into a profitable cash crop economy almost overnight. And tobacco profits are what actually funded the colony's survival and expansion, not any of the heroic founding narratives told afterward. That profitable cash crop model, once proven, was replicated relentlessly across England's Caribbean colonies, and this is where the deepest, most consequential moral cost of the entire empire begins. Parallel to the Caribbean and North American colonies, Britain was also developing an entirely different colonial model on the far side of the world, one built not around plantation labor, but around mass settlement and the displacement, rather than enslavement, of existing populations. Captain James Cook's voyages along the eastern coast of Australia in 1770 led Britain to claim the continent under the legal doctrine of Terra Nullius, Latin for nobody's land, a deliberate legal fiction that treated Australia as unowned and unoccupied, despite the presence of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who had lived there continuously for at least 65,000 years, among the longest continuous cultures in human history. Britain's first settlement, established at Botany Bay in 1788, was explicitly a penal colony, created partly to relieve overcrowded British prisons following the loss of the American colonies, which had previously served as Britain's primary dumping ground for convicted criminals. Over the following 80 years, Britain transported roughly 160,000 convicts to Australia, alongside a growing population of free settlers who steadily expanded onto Aboriginal land, frequently through violent frontier conflict, disease introduced by European contact, and the systematic destruction of the ecological and economic base that Aboriginal communities depended on for survival. Historians now estimate that Aboriginal Australia's population may have fallen by as much as 90% within the first century of British colonization, through a combination of introduced disease, violence, and displacement, one of the most severe demographic collapses inflicted on any colonized population anywhere in the empire. Canada followed a different but related pattern. Britain had seized French colonial territory in Canada following the 7 Years' War, formalized by the Treaty of Paris in 1763, inheriting a substantial French-speaking Catholic population in Quebec, that Britain, somewhat unusually for its colonial administration elsewhere, chose to accommodate rather than forcibly assimilate, granting continued legal recognition to French civil law and the Catholic Church through the Quebec Act of 1774, a pragmatic decision driven less by tolerance than by the recognition that alienating French Canadians risked pushing them toward the increasingly rebellious American colonies to the south. Indigenous nations across Canada, meanwhile, experienced a slower but similarly devastating pattern of treaty violation, land seizure, and, eventually, a residential school system beginning in the 19th century that forcibly removed Indigenous children from their families in an explicit, officially stated policy goal of eliminating Indigenous languages and cultures, a system whose full scope and human cost, including thousands of documented child deaths, would not be widely acknowledged by the Canadian and British governments until formal inquiries and apologies over a century later. Barbados, colonized in 1627, became the prototype for a plantation economy built almost entirely on enslaved African labor, producing sugar for European markets at a scale and profitability that transformed the English economy. The English, later British, transatlantic slave trade would go on to forcibly transport an estimated 3.1 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic between the 16th and 19th centuries, a portion of the broader transatlantic trade that moved over 12 million people in total, of whom an estimated 1.8 million did not survive the voyage itself. British ports, including Liverpool and Bristol, grew wealthy almost entirely on the logistics of this trade, ensuring slave ships, financing plantation loans, and manufacturing the goods traded for captives on the West African coast. This was not a peripheral detail of empire. For roughly 2 centuries, human trafficking on an industrial scale was one of the central economic engines financing British colonial expansion, and the profits extracted from it helped fund the very infrastructure, banks, and country estates that still stand across Britain today. Britain's eventual turn against the slave trade it had built much of its colonial wealth on is frequently presented, particularly in older popular history, as a story of moral awakening, and there is real substance to that story. A persistent, decades-long abolitionist movement, led by figures including William Wilberforce in Parliament, and a broader coalition of religious campaigners, formerly enslaved writers and speakers such as Olaudah Equiano, and ordinary British citizens who organized boycotts of slave-produced sugar, eventually succeeded in banning the transatlantic slave trade within the British Empire in 1807, and then abolishing slavery itself across most of the empire in 1833. But the full story includes a detail rarely emphasized in the celebratory version. When slavery was abolished, the British government paid approximately £20 million in compensation, a staggering sum at the time, equivalent to roughly 40% of the entire annual government budget, financed through a loan so large that British taxpayers were still making payments on it until 2015, not to the people who had been enslaved, but to the roughly 46,000 British slave owners, as compensation for the loss of what the law had, until that point, classified as their property. Enslaved people themselves received no compensation whatsoever, and in many colonies were instead required to continue working for their former owners without pay, under a transitional system euphemistically called apprenticeship, for several additional years after formal abolition. Even Britain's most celebrated moral reform of the imperial era, in other words, was structured in a way that prioritized compensating the beneficiaries of slavery over the people who had actually suffered under it, a pattern of the empire correcting its worst abuses while still protecting the financial interests built on top of them, which would repeat, in different forms, again and again across the remaining century of colonial rule. While the Caribbean and American colonies were being built on plantation slavery, the East India Company was pursuing a very different model on the other side of the world, and it would prove even more consequential to the shape of the eventual empire. Initially, the company operated as a trading operation, establishing fortified trading posts at Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta, with permission from local Mughal and regional rulers, exchanging English silver and goods for Indian textiles, spices, and saltpeter, the key ingredient in gunpowder. But as Mughal central authority weakened through the 18th century, fragmenting into competing regional powers, the company began doing something no trading company had done at this scale before: recruiting and arming its own private military force, composed largely of Indian soldiers called sepoys under British officers, to protect its trading interests and, increasingly, to seize territory outright. The decisive turning point came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey in Bengal, where a company army under Robert Clive defeated the forces of the Nawab of Bengal through a combination of battlefield tactics and, crucially, bribery. Clive had secretly arranged for a key commander in the Nawab's own army to betray him during the battle, in exchange for being installed as the new puppet ruler afterward. The victory handed the East India Company effective control over Bengal, one of the wealthiest and most populous regions in the world, and with it, direct access to Bengal's tax revenue. A private company, answerable to shareholders in London rather than any government, had just become the effective ruler of tens of millions of people, extracting land taxes at a scale that historians estimate drained enormous wealth out of Bengal and into company and British coffers within a matter of years. Robert Clive himself became almost a cautionary case study in the corrupting potential of unchecked colonial power. He returned to Britain from India, an extraordinarily wealthy man, having personally extracted a fortune through a combination of official company salary, private trading privileges, and outright gifts extracted from Indian rulers under implicit threat, and was later formally investigated by a British parliamentary committee in 1773 over allegations of corruption and abuse of power in India, an inquiry that, remarkably for the era, actually happened, reflecting genuine unease even among British elites about how far company rule had strayed from any recognizable standard of governance. Clive was ultimately cleared of formal wrongdoing by Parliament, though the committee's own chairman reportedly acknowledged privately that Clive's conduct in India could not be defended by ordinary standards of honesty, only excused by the extraordinary and largely unregulated circumstances in which it had occurred. Clive died in 1774, by his own hand according to most historical accounts, a wealthy and celebrated public figure, whose fortune and reputation nonetheless remained permanently entangled with the accusations of extortion and corruption that had followed him back from Bengal. Within a decade of taking control, a catastrophic famine struck Bengal in 1770, killing an estimated 10 million people, roughly a third of the region's population, and the company's own tax collection policies during the famine, which continued extracting revenue from a starving population rather than providing meaningful relief, are considered by many historians to have significantly worsened the death toll rather than merely coinciding with a natural disaster. The pattern of company rule producing catastrophic human cost alongside enormous private profit eventually became embarrassing enough and destabilizing enough that the British government began asserting direct oversight. The East India Company's search for profitable exports to China produced one of the most morally indefensible episodes in the entire empire's history, and one that illustrates just how directly British commercial interests were willing to override both foreign sovereignty and basic public health. By the early 19th century, British merchants faced a persistent trade imbalance with China. British consumers wanted enormous quantities of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, while China's imperial government showed little interest in most British manufactured goods in return, insisting on payment in silver. The East India Company's solution was to cultivate opium in British-controlled India and smuggle it into China in massive and growing quantities, creating a large and rapidly expanding population of Chinese opium addicts and reversing the trade imbalance entirely, this time in Britain's favor at the direct cost of Chinese public health and social stability. When the Qing government attempted to stop the trade in 1839, confiscating and destroying over 1,000 tons of British opium at the port of Canton, Britain responded not with diplomatic negotiation, but with war. The First Opium War, fought from 1839 to 1842, ended in decisive British victory, forcing China to sign the Treaty of Nanking, cede Hong Kong to British control, open several Chinese ports to British trade on terms dictated by London, and pay a large war indemnity. A second Opium War, fought jointly with France between 1856 and 1860, further expanded these forced trading privileges and resulted in British and French forces looting and burning the old summer palace outside Beijing, an act of cultural destruction still remembered with considerable bitterness in China today. Hong Kong itself would remain under British colonial control for 156 years, not returning to Chinese sovereignty until 1997, meaning the direct legal consequence of a war fought to protect Britain's right to sell an addictive narcotic outlived the empire that started it by decades. Following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, a massive, bloody uprising by Indian soldiers and civilians against company rule, triggered partly by the introduction of rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat, deeply offensive to both Hindu and Muslim sepoys, and more broadly by decades of accumulated resentment over land seizures, taxation, and cultural interference. The British government abolished the East India Company entirely in 1858 and placed India under direct crown rule, a period known as the British Raj. Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India in 1876, and for the following 7 decades, India functioned as what contemporaries openly called the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, its largest colonial possession by population, its most valuable source of raw materials and army recruits, and the territory whose administration British colonial officials treated as the model to be replicated everywhere else the empire expanded. The administrative apparatus Britain built to govern India directly reveals how thin the actual British presence was relative to the population it controlled. and how much the entire system depended on projected authority rather than raw numerical force. At the height of the Raj, the Indian civil service, the elite corps of officials who administered the subcontinent's provinces, courts, and revenue collection, numbered only around 1,000 British officers, governing a population that, by the early 20th century, exceeded 300 million people, a ratio of roughly one British administrator for every 300,000 Indians. This was only possible because the British had inherited and adapted much of the existing Mughal-era administrative and taxation infrastructure, employed enormous numbers of Indian clerks, judges, and lower officials to carry out the actual day-to-day work of governance, and maintained a standing army in India, the largest volunteer army in the world by the early 20th century, that was itself overwhelmingly composed of Indian soldiers commanded by a comparatively small British officer corps. The entire system rested on a calculated psychological premise as much as a military one, that the appearance of total, unshakable British authority, reinforced through grand public ceremony, architecture, and periodic displays of overwhelming force when genuinely challenged, could substitute for the manpower Britain simply did not have to enforce direct control over such an enormous population by numbers alone. The 19th century, particularly its second half, is when the empire reached the scale and self-mythology most people picture when they hear the phrase, the British Empire. Industrialization at home created an economy that needed raw materials, cotton, rubber, tin, palm oil, and needed overseas markets to sell manufactured goods back into, and colonial territories were reshaped explicitly to serve this two-way extraction. The relationship between empire and industry ran in both directions, and neither one functioned without the other. Britain's cotton textile industry, centered in Lancashire mill towns and often cited as the engine of the entire Industrial Revolution, depended almost entirely on raw cotton imported from the American South before the Civil War, and increasingly from British India afterward, spun and woven in British factories, and then sold back, frequently at prices deliberately structured to undercut and destroy India's own centuries-old domestic textile industry, into colonial markets that British trade policy prevented from developing competing industries of their own. Indian handloom weavers, whose cotton and silk textiles had been prized luxury exports to Europe for centuries before British rule, saw their industry systematically dismantled over the 19th century, not through some inevitable natural economic shift, but through a combination of tariffs favoring British manufactured cloth, the deliberate suppression of Indian industrial development, and the colonial administration's structuring of Indian agriculture around raw material export rather than domestic manufacturing. The British economist and nationalist Dadabhai Naoroji, writing in the late 19th century, coined the term drain theory to describe this dynamic. Wealth extracted from India through taxation, trade policy, and unpaid or underpaid administrative costs, flowing consistently out of the colony and into Britain. A one-directional transfer of capital that Naoroji and later economic historians estimated at a scale sufficient to have meaningfully funded India's own industrial development, had that wealth been permitted to remain and circulate within the colony instead. Britain's Royal Navy, the most powerful in the world for most of the 19th century, enforced a global trading system that favored British shipping, British insurance, and British finance at every port it touched, giving rise to the confident, self-congratulating phrase that the sun never sets on the British Empire, a boast about scale that quietly avoided asking what the empire's subjects actually thought about the arrangement. The so-called Scramble for Africa, concentrated overwhelmingly into roughly 2 decades between 1880 and 1900, illustrates just how arbitrarily this global system operated. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, European powers, including Britain, sat around a table in Germany and divided the entire African continent into colonial territories, drawing borders on maps largely without African representation, input, or even, in many cases, accurate knowledge of the actual ethnic, linguistic, and political boundaries already existing on the ground. Straight lines drawn by European bureaucrats cut directly through existing kingdoms, ethnic groups, and trade networks, creating artificial states that combined rival peoples into single colonial units, or split single peoples across multiple colonies, a decision whose consequences, including some of the most devastating ethnic conflicts of the 20th century, are still being lived through by the countries that inherited those borders after independence. Britain alone, by the early 20th century, controlled territory across Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Kenya, Uganda, Rhodesia, and South Africa, among others, extracting gold, diamonds, rubber, and cheap labor from a continent whose own political structures had been dismantled or subordinated to serve London's economic interests. Cecil Rhodes, the businessman and politician whose British South Africa Company drove much of Britain's expansion into southern and central Africa, and whose name was given to the colonies of northern and southern Rhodesia, exemplified how personal commercial ambition and formal colonial policy were often functionally indistinguishable during this period. Rhodes explicitly articulated his imperial ambitions in openly supremacist terms, writing that he regarded the Anglo-Saxon race as the finest race in the world, and believed its expansion across as much of the globe as possible was both a moral good and Britain's civilizational duty, views that were not fringe positions at the time, but reflected mainstream justifications used by British political and commercial elites to frame colonial expansion as a benevolent enterprise rather than what it materially was, the forced extraction of land, minerals, and labor from African societies who had not requested any of it. The British South Africa Company operated its own private police force, negotiated and frequently coerced land and mineral concessions from African rulers under terms many later contested as fraudulent or obtained under duress, and effectively governed vast territories with only nominal oversight from the British government in London, echoing, nearly a century and a half later, the exact same private company as colonial government model the East India Company had pioneered in Bengal. Britain's method of control across this enormous and varied empire was rarely uniform, and understanding that variation matters because it reveals how deliberately calculated colonial administration actually was. In some territories, particularly those with large European settler populations like Australia, Canada, and eventually South Africa and Rhodesia, Britain granted increasing degrees of self-government, evolving these colonies into self-governing dominions with their own parliaments while remaining nominally loyal to the British Crown. In other territories, particularly across much of Africa and parts of Asia, Britain practiced what colonial administrators called indirect rule, governing through existing local chiefs, kings, or aristocracies who were co-opted, bribed, or coerced into enforcing British policy on Britain's behalf, allowing a remarkably small number of British administrators to control enormous populations without the expense of a full occupying bureaucracy. This is not an accident of administrative convenience. It was a deliberate strategy, refined across the empire, to make colonial rule as cheap and as durable as possible, by turning local power structures into instruments of imperial control rather than replacing them outright. And it frequently worked by deliberately amplifying existing ethnic, religious, or caste divisions, elevating one group over another to administer a colony, a strategy of divide and rule whose social and political consequences outlasted British rule itself by generations. The human cost of maintaining this system, when local populations resisted, was frequently severe and frequently suppressed from public knowledge in Britain itself at the time. In India, the Amritsar Massacre of 1919 saw British troops under General Reginald Dyer open fire without warning on a crowd of unarmed civilians, including women and children, gathered for a peaceful protest and religious festival in an enclosed public garden called Jallianwala Bagh, killing at minimum several hundred people and likely over 1,000 by some estimates, with no means of escape from the walled enclosure. In Kenya during the 1950s, British forces suppressed the Mau Mau uprising through a system of detention camps where tens of thousands of Kikuyu people were held, and where documented evidence, largely suppressed for decades until British government files were finally released following a 2011 legal case, confirmed systematic torture, including castration and severe beatings, carried out under official colonial authority. These were not isolated rogue incidents dismissed as embarrassing exceptions at the time. They were the sharpest visible edge of a colonial system that, when its authority was directly challenged, was consistently willing to use overwhelming and often lethal force to preserve it. The empire's peak coincided almost exactly with its first serious internal contradiction becoming impossible to ignore. An empire that justified itself at home through language about liberty, law, and civilization was simultaneously denying basic political rights and frequently basic physical safety to the vast majority of the people it actually ruled. Southern Africa produced one of the clearest illustrations of how far Britain was willing to go to protect colonial economic interests, once gold and diamonds entered the equation. The discovery of massive diamond deposits at Kimberley in 1871 and gold on the Witwatersrand in 1886 transformed the region from a colonial backwater into one of the most valuable pieces of territory in the entire empire, and brought Britain into direct conflict with the Boers, descendants of earlier Dutch settlers who had established their own independent republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, in the interior. The resulting Second Boer War, fought from 1899 to 1902, saw Britain deploy nearly 500,000 soldiers against a much smaller Boer force. And when conventional battlefield tactics failed to quickly suppress determined Boer guerrilla resistance, the British military adopted a scorched earth policy, burning Boer farms and crops, and interned Boer civilians, including women and children, along with black African civilians, in concentration camps, a term the British themselves used at the time. Conditions in these camps were catastrophic. Poor sanitation, insufficient food, and disease killed an estimated 26,000 Boer civilians, the majority of them children, along with an estimated 20,000 or more Black African internees held in separate, generally even worse resourced camps, whose death toll was for decades significantly under-recorded compared to the Boer camps. The scandal, once reported by British journalists and campaigners including Emily Hobhouse, caused genuine domestic political outrage in Britain, but it did not prevent Britain from ultimately winning the war and absorbing the gold and diamond wealth of the former Boer republics into the empire regardless. The empire's final and arguably most humiliating geopolitical moment arrived not through colonial rebellion, but through a single failed military intervention that revealed, unmistakably, how much global power Britain had actually lost. In 1956, when Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, a waterway Britain had controlled since the 19th century and considered a vital strategic and economic lifeline, connecting Britain to India and its remaining eastern territories, Britain, along with France and Israel, launched a coordinated military invasion to retake it by force. The operation was a military success but a political catastrophe. The United States, under President Eisenhower, refused to support the invasion and applied severe financial pressure, including threatening to sell off British currency reserves, forcing a humiliating British withdrawal within weeks. The Suez Crisis is frequently identified by historians as the precise moment the rest of the world, and Britain itself, understood definitively that Britain could no longer act as an independent global power without American approval. A symbolic passing of the imperial torch that arrived not through a dramatic final battle, but through a failed invasion Britain wasn't even permitted to finish. Even as the formal empire dissolved, Britain's relationship with its former colonial subjects did not simply end. Following the Second World War, facing severe labor shortages needed to rebuild a war-damaged economy, the British government actively encouraged migration from Caribbean colonies, offering the same British citizenship rights that colonial subjects had technically held throughout the empire's existence. The ship Empire Windrush, which arrived at Tilbury Docks in 1948, carrying several hundred Caribbean migrants, recruited to fill British labor shortages, became the symbolic starting point of what is now called the Windrush generation. Hundreds of thousands of Caribbean, and later South Asian and African, migrants who settled in Britain over the following decades, fundamentally reshaping British society, culture, and demographics, often while facing significant racial discrimination in housing, employment, and everyday life, despite holding full legal British citizenship. Decades later, in 2018, it emerged that the British government had wrongly detained, denied legal rights to, and in some cases deported members of the Windrush generation and their British-born children due to changes in immigration policy and documentation requirements that disproportionately affected exactly this community, a scandal widely seen as a direct, late-arriving consequence of an empire that had once demanded loyalty and labor from its colonial subjects, and then, once the empire it built no longer needed them the same way, struggled to fully honor the citizenship it had originally promised them. British political culture prided itself on parliamentary democracy, habeas corpus, and the rule of law, rights that in practice were reserved almost entirely for British citizens in Britain itself, while colonial subjects across most of the empire had no meaningful vote, no parliamentary representation, and were governed under separate, frequently harsher legal codes explicitly designed for colonial administration rather than the protections British citizens enjoyed at home. This gap between imperial rhetoric and colonial reality did not go unnoticed by the people living inside it, and it became one of the central arguments used by independence movements across the empire throughout the 20th century. If British values genuinely included liberty and self-determination, colonized peoples argued, those values needed to apply to them too. Two world wars, rather than strengthening the empire further, ultimately broke its financial and political capacity to hold itself together. Britain entered the First World War as the world's dominant financial power and emerged from it as a debtor nation, having borrowed enormous sums, largely from the United States, to fund the war effort, while losing roughly 1 million British and colonial soldiers, including hundreds of thousands recruited from India, Africa, and the Caribbean, who fought and died for an empire that offered most of them no meaningful political rights in return. India alone contributed an estimated 1.3 million soldiers and laborers to the British war effort during the First World War, and roughly 74,000 of them died, fighting in theaters from the Western Front in France to Mesopotamia and East Africa, in a conflict most had no direct stake in beyond the demands of colonial obligation, and the promises of expanded self-government frequently made to secure this colonial cooperation were, in the years immediately following the war, either delayed, diluted, or broken outright, deepening the resentment that would eventually fuel the independence movements of the following decades. The Second World War proved even more financially devastating, and it also became, in a genuinely direct sense, an empire-wide war rather than simply a British one. Soldiers from India, Africa, the Caribbean, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand fought across nearly every major theater of the war, from North Africa to Burma to Italy, and colonial resources, rubber, oil, food, and manufacturing capacity, were mobilized on a scale that placed enormous strain on colonial economies and populations, already weakened by decades of extractive economic policy. The Bengal Famine of 1943, which killed an estimated 2 to 3 million people, occurred while wartime shipping and grain export policy, set by British colonial administrators prioritizing military supply chains, continued diverting food resources away from the famine-stricken region. A catastrophe Winston Churchill's own wartime cabinet has been documented, through surviving records and correspondence, discussing with a level of indifference toward Indian civilian suffering that remains one of the most heavily debated and criticized aspects of his wartime leadership among historians today. Britain again borrowed massively, this time overwhelmingly from the United States through Lend-Lease arrangements, and emerged in 1945 as a country whose economy was, in relative global terms, badly weakened, while colonial populations across the empire, having fought and died in enormous numbers for a war explicitly framed by British and Allied propaganda as a fight against tyranny and for freedom, increasingly and understandably demanded that same freedom be extended to themselves. Indian independence, achieved in 1947, became both the empire's largest single loss of territory and one of the most consequential and violent transitions of the entire decolonization era. Faced with a rising, well-organized independence movement led by figures including Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, and a British government that could no longer afford the financial or political cost of holding India by force, Britain agreed to withdraw, but did so on a compressed timeline of only a few months, and through a partition plan that divided British India into a Hindu-majority India and a Muslim-majority Pakistan, drawn largely by a British lawyer, Cecil Radcliffe, who had never previously visited India and was given only about 5 weeks to determine the new border. The resulting mass migration, as an estimated 14 to 20 million people crossed the new borders in both directions, triggered communal violence that killed an estimated 1 to 2 million people and remains one of the largest and most violent forced population displacements in modern history, a final, catastrophic illustration of how casually and how consequentially colonial borders had been drawn throughout the empire's history, right up until its very end. What followed India's independence was a rapid, cascading collapse of the empire across the following 3 decades, a pace of dissolution that stunned observers who had assumed British imperial withdrawal, if it came at all, would happen gradually over generations. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence in 1957, and within the following decade, more than 24 additional African nations followed, most gaining independence between 1960 and 1968 alone, a period so compressed that 1960 is still remembered in African history as the Year of Africa, when 17 separate nations achieved independence within 12 months. Britain, having spent centuries building an empire through gradual, incremental expansion, dismantled the majority of it within roughly a single generation, a reversal in pace that reflected just how unsustainable colonial administration had become, both financially, given Britain's post-war economic weakness, and politically, given the scale and organization of independence movements Britain could no longer suppress without unacceptable domestic and international political cost. Not every transition was peaceful, and Britain's response to independence movements it judged threatening remained, right up until the empire's final years, willing to use methods that echoed the same overwhelming force applied at Amritsar and in the Mau Mau camps decades earlier. In Malaya, Britain fought a 12-year counterinsurgency campaign against communist guerrillas from 1948 to 1960, involving the forced relocation of hundreds of thousands of rural civilians into guarded settlements called new villages, a strategy later studied and partially replicated by the United States in Vietnam. In Cyprus, a 4-year armed independence struggle against British rule during the 1950s was met with a declared state of emergency, mass detentions, and later credible allegations of prisoner torture that surfaced decades afterward in released government files. In Aden, in what is now Yemen, British forces fought a bitter and ultimately unsuccessful counterinsurgency campaign through the late 1960s, before withdrawing entirely in 1967, one of the empire's final and most openly acknowledged military failures. Across nearly every one of these conflicts, a now familiar pattern repeated. Independence movements framed by British officials at the time as extremist insurgencies to be suppressed by force, later reassessed by historians, and in several cases by British courts following legal challenges from surviving veterans of these movements, as legitimate anti-colonial struggles met with policies that, by any contemporary legal standard, constituted serious and systematic human rights violations. What Britain built to manage this unraveling, rather than simply walking away entirely, was the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of former colonies that retained economic, cultural, and diplomatic ties to Britain and to each other, without any formal political subordination. It was, in its own way, another example of the same adaptive instinct that had defined British imperial strategy from the beginning. Rather than accepting a total and abrupt loss of influence, restructure the relationship into something that could survive the end of formal empire, preserving trade networks, the English language, and diplomatic connections long after direct political control had ended. Today, the Commonwealth includes 56 member nations, the vast majority of them former British colonies, still connected through institutions, sporting competitions, and diplomatic frameworks that trace directly back to empire, even as many of those same nations have, in recent decades, increasingly debated removing the British monarch as symbolic head of state and reckoning more directly and publicly with the colonial history that connected them to Britain in the first place. The legacy left behind is neither simply positive nor simply negative, and pretending otherwise misrepresents the actual historical record. English is now spoken, in some form, by an estimated 1.5 billion people worldwide, more than any language in human history, largely as a direct consequence of colonial administration, education systems, and trade networks Britain imposed across its former territories. Common law legal systems, parliamentary structures, and railway networks built during the colonial period still form the administrative backbone of dozens of independent nations today. Cultural exchange under empire, even when built on deeply unequal terms, produced a set of institutions and practices that former colonies did not simply inherit passively, but actively reshaped and, in several notable cases, came to dominate more completely than Britain itself. Cricket, introduced to India, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa as a marker of British cultural refinement and colonial social hierarchy, is today followed more passionately and generates more commercial revenue in India than in England. With the Indian Premier League now standing as the wealthiest cricket competition in the world, a striking reversal in which a game exported as a tool of colonial cultural authority became, within a few generations of independence, a symbol of post-colonial national pride and economic power in the very countries it was once used to help govern. English-language literature produced by writers from former colonies, including Nigeria's Chinua Achebe, whose 1958 novel, Things Fall Apart, directly examined the human cost of colonial disruption to traditional Igbo society, and numerous Booker Prize-winning authors from India, the Caribbean, and Africa in the decades since, has become some of the most celebrated and widely studied literature in the English language worldwide, produced in a language originally imposed through colonial education policy, now wielded by writers from formerly colonized nations to tell their own histories on their own terms, often as a direct critique of the empire that first brought that language to their shores. At the same time, the artificial borders drawn during the Scramble for Africa and the Radcliffe Partition of India continue to fuel ethnic and religious conflict in multiple regions today, decades after independence. Economic structures built explicitly to extract raw materials from colonies for processing and profit in Britain left many former colonies with distorted, resource-dependent economies that independence alone did not automatically fix, a pattern economists still study as a contributing factor in ongoing global inequality between former colonial powers and former colonies. Britain profited immensely for centuries from slavery, forced labor, land seizure, and the deliberate suppression of local political and economic development across roughly a quarter of the entire planet, and the wealth extracted through that system helped fund the Industrial Revolution, the modern British state, and institutions that still exist prominently in Britain today. That reckoning, largely deferred for decades after the empire's formal end, has become increasingly public and increasingly difficult for British institutions to avoid in the 21st century. Museums including the British Museum face sustained international pressure and formal government requests from Greece, Nigeria, and Ethiopia among others to return artifacts acquired during the colonial period, most prominently the Parthenon marbles, removed from Greece in the early 19th century, and the Benin bronzes. Thousands of intricately cast brass and ivory artworks, looted by a British military expedition that burned the city of Benin in 1897, in retaliation for an earlier ambush of a British trade delegation, an expedition whose scale of looting was so extensive that Benin bronzes are now held in museum collections across dozens of countries worldwide, far more of them outside Nigeria than inside it. Some institutions have begun returning individual pieces in recent years, while the British Museum itself remains legally restricted by a 1963 Act of Parliament that prohibits it from permanently deaccessioning most of its collection, meaning any large-scale repatriation would require an act of the British government rather than simply a museum decision. Public monuments have become another visible battleground for this reckoning. In 2020, during a wave of Black Lives Matter protests following the murder of George Floyd in the United States, protesters in Bristol toppled a statue of Edward Colston, a 17th-century merchant and slave trader whose wealth, generated substantially through the transatlantic slave trade, had funded numerous local charitable institutions still bearing his name, and rolled it into the city's harbor, an act that triggered a national debate about which historical figures deserved continued public commemoration and which represented a selective, sanitized version of imperial history that omitted its human cost. Universities, including Glasgow and Cambridge, have conducted formal historical audits of their own institutional links to slavery and colonial wealth, in several cases publicly acknowledging that scholarships, buildings, and endowments were funded, directly or indirectly, by profits connected to the slave trade or colonial extraction, and have begun committing funds toward reparative initiatives, including scholarships for students from formerly colonized nations, as a partial response. The question of financial reparations for colonialism and slavery, meanwhile, remains one of the most contentious live political issues connected to the empire's legacy. Caribbean nations, through the CARICOM Reparations Commission, established in 2013, have formally requested reparations from Britain, France, and the Netherlands for the transatlantic slave trade and its lasting economic consequences, including a formal apology, debt cancellation, and investment in public health and education infrastructure in the region. Demands that successive British governments have, as of the time of this recording, consistently declined to formally accept or negotiate, generally citing the passage of time and the legal complexity of assigning contemporary financial liability for historical policy. India, similarly, has seen a resurgence of public and political interest in the scale of colonial-era wealth extraction, driven partly by economic historians' more precise recent estimates. One widely cited academic calculation places the value of wealth drained from India to Britain between 1765 and 1938 at approximately $45 trillion in current terms, a figure that, whatever its precise methodological debates, has become a significant reference point in ongoing Indian political and public discourse about the true economic legacy of British rule. So the original question, how did a small, damp island end up ruling a quarter of the world, and why did that empire collapse within a single lifetime after centuries of expansion, has an answer. And it is a less comfortable one than the story empire builders told about themselves at the time. Britain's rise was not the result of some unique national virtue or civilizing mission, however often that language was used to justify it. It was the result of naval technology, financial innovation, ruthless opportunism during moments of rival weakness, and a consistent willingness to use overwhelming force against resistance, wrapped afterward in a moral vocabulary about liberty and progress that rarely extended to the people actually living under colonial rule. And its collapse was equally unglamorous. Not a single dramatic defeat, but a slow financial exhaustion through 2 world wars, combined with independence movements that finally made the cost of maintaining empire by force higher than Britain, weakened and in debt, was willing or able to pay. What makes this story different from a simple rise and fall narrative is how directly its consequences continue shaping the present, not as distant historical trivia, but as active, ongoing political and economic reality. The borders of Iraq, Kuwait, Jordan, and much of the modern Middle East were drawn substantially by British and French officials during and after the First World War, under the Sykes-Picot Agreement and subsequent League of Nations mandates, frequently with far less regard for existing ethnic, religious, and tribal boundaries than for securing access to newly discovered oil reserves and strategic control of the region. Decisions whose consequences continue to shape conflict and instability in the region a full century later. The partition of India and the Radcliffe Line still defines one of the most militarized and unresolved border disputes on Earth. In Kashmir, Nigeria, assembled by British administrators from hundreds of previously distinct ethnic and religious communities into a single colonial territory for administrative convenience, has experienced repeated civil conflict, including the Biafran War of the late 1960s, rooted substantially in tensions between groups that colonial-era borders forced into a single national framework, never designed with their actual consent or cohesion in mind. The empire's true legacy is not a story of glory or a story of pure villainy. It is the story of a small island that reorganized the political map of the entire modern world in the space of about 3 centuries, and left nearly every country it touched still working through the consequences of exactly how that reorganization was done. Its languages, its laws, its railways, its universities, its borders, its wealth, and its wounds, all of them still visibly, measurably present in the world you are watching this video in right now.